My name is Mary Evans. I'm 52 years old, and this is the story of how my only son broke my heart in a way I never thought possible. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear his voice and feel how the room seemed to shrink around me that night. It was a quiet Tuesday evening in my kitchen, the kind of night where the air feels heavy but calm. The clock ticked on the wall, and the faint smell of chicken and rice lingered from dinner. Jason stood by the counter, arms crossed, his eyes hard, in a way I didn't recognize anymore. He didn't even clear his throat before saying it, his words landing like a blade. "You can't be my real mom. Look at you. You're too poor. I must come from someone better." For a second, I just stared at him, my mind refusing to process what he'd said. I thought maybe I'd misheard, maybe he was joking, but the way his jaw tightened told me he meant every word. My hands, still resting on the kitchen table, felt cold and heavy, like they didn't belong to me. I tried to answer, but my mouth was dry, and all I could manage was a faint breath. My heart ached so fiercely it felt like something had torn inside me. I held his gaze as long as I could, but his eyes were so sharp, so full of contempt, that I had to look away. It was hard to believe this was my Jason. The boy I'd raised, the boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, the boy who once told me I was the best mom in the world. I didn't recognize the man standing in front of me now, looking at me like I was some stranger who'd wronged him. I wanted to speak, to tell him how much he was hurting me, but the words caught in my throat. I forced my hands to stay still on the table, even though I wanted to reach out and shake him, make him see me. Instead, I swallowed hard and managed to keep my voice level. "What would you do if your own child said that to you?" I never thought I'd have to ask myself that question. Yet here I was, staring at my son, feeling like the world had shifted under my feet. The kitchen that had always been my little refuge now felt colder than ever. Even as the tears threatened to spill, I refused to let him see me cry. Somewhere deep down, I told myself I couldn't let this break me, but the truth is, it already had. I still remember the day his father left, though I try not to dwell on it anymore. Jason was barely 3, still clinging to my leg, when the door slammed shut behind him. In that moment, I promised myself that no matter what it took, I would give my boy a good life. Those first few years were the hardest. I worked 2 jobs during the day and picked up extra shifts on weekends just to keep us afloat. There were times I would come home so tired my feet felt like lead, but the moment I saw Jason waiting by the window with his little hands pressed to the glass, I'd forget how exhausted I was. I learned to stretch every dollar, making grocery lists that fit within my tiny budget and scouring thrift stores for decent clothes that he could wear to school without feeling embarrassed. I cut his hair at home, sitting him on a stool in the kitchen while he wriggled and laughed as the clippers buzzed. Sometimes I stayed up late sewing buttons back onto shirts or patching holes in his jeans so no one would notice. There was one winter when he got sick, really sick, and I sat in the hospital next to his bed, watching the monitor beep, praying to God he'd be okay. The doctor told me his fever was dangerous, and I knew I couldn't afford the bill. That night, I took off my wedding ring, the last piece of that old life, and walked into a pawn shop. It didn't matter to me what they gave me for it. Nothing mattered except getting him the medicine he needed. But it wasn't all sacrifice. There were so many little moments that made it all worthwhile. I still feel the weight of him curled up on my chest asleep, after a nightmare, his tiny breath warm on my neck. I remember how he used to stand on his tiptoes to kiss my cheek before getting on the school bus, his backpack twice as big as he was. One night, after a long day of cleaning houses, I sat on the edge of his bed just to check on him. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked at me sleepy, but smiling, and said I was the best mom in the world. I carried those words with me through every hard day, every lonely night. I never let him see how much I worried. When we couldn't afford new shoes, I told him his old one still looked sharp. When I skipped dinner so he'd have enough, I joked about being on a diet. He never needed to know how often I cried in the shower or how many times I went to bed with nothing but an ache in my stomach. Everything I did was for him. Every decision, every sacrifice, every single choice I made came back to him. He was my reason, my joy, my whole world. Even now, thinking of that little boy who used to hold my hand so tight, I feel my chest tighten with love and just a little bit of sadness for how much he's changed. I would do it all over again, even knowing where we are now. Because no matter what he thinks, he's always been my son. And no amount of money or blood can change that. I started noticing the change when he met her. Madison was beautiful, no doubt about it, with perfect hair and clothes that looked like they belonged in a magazine. But behind her smile was a sharpness I could feel even before she opened her mouth. The first time she came over, she looked around our little kitchen like she couldn't believe people actually lived that way. Her eyes landed on the faded curtains and the dented fridge before she laughed softly and said something about how quaint it all was. I pretended not to hear, but the way Jason glanced at me, almost embarrassed, stung worse than her words. After that, he started pulling away. He stopped asking me to pack him lunches and told me not to come pick him up at school anymore because Madison's brother could give him a ride. He would barely say 2 words to me when he got home, always hurrying to change into nicer clothes before she came to pick him up. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me with this strange mix of pity and frustration, like I was holding him back somehow. The warmth in his eyes, the softness that had always been there, was gone. Every time I tried to reach him, he just drifted farther, and no matter what I did, I couldn't seem to pull him back. It was the little things that hurt the most. How he flinched when Madison made a comment about my hands being rough from cleaning. How he never corrected her when she called our neighborhood a dump. How he avoided introducing me to her friends like I was something to be hidden. I used to be his whole world. Now I felt like nothing more than a shadow in the corner of his life. Watching him slip away like that left me cold inside, but all I could do was stand there and wonder when exactly my little boy had decided he was too good for me. He came through the door that evening with a manila envelope clutched in his hand and a look on his face I didn't recognize. His shoulders were stiff, his jaw tight, and he didn't even bother to take his coat off before tossing the envelope on the kitchen table. I stood there, wiping my hands on a dish towel, my heart already sinking before he even said a word. He finally looked up at me and said he'd already sent his DNA to some company to find his real parents. His voice was flat, but his eyes were sharp, daring me to say something. I swallowed hard and asked why barely above a whisper, though I already feared the answer. That was when he raised his voice louder than I'd ever heard him in my life. He said I wasn't who he deserved. That he didn't belong here, not in this house, not with me. Every word landed like a slap, and I felt my hands tremble, though I forced them to stay at my sides. For a moment, the room was quiet, except for the sound of my own breathing, heavy and uneven. I stared at him, at the boy I raised and loved more than anything, and I barely recognized the man in front of me. The words were still ringing in my ears when I finally nodded. Fine. Do what you have to do. That was all I could manage, and even then my voice cracked just enough for me to hear it. He didn't stay to look at me, didn't wait for another word. He just grabbed the envelope and walked down the hall, leaving me standing there in the kitchen, feeling like the walls were closing in around me. The phone rang early that morning, sharp and insistent, cutting through the quiet of the house. I was standing at the sink when Jason answered it, his back to me, his shoulders rigid. He didn't say much, just a few clipped words before hanging up and standing there in silence, the phone still in his hand. He turned to face me, then his expression cold and certain, and told me the results were back. I already knew what he was about to say before the words came out. He said I wasn't his biological mother, that the test proved it, and something in my chest cracked open as I listened. Without another word, he disappeared into his room and started pulling clothes from his drawers, throwing them into a duffel bag like he couldn't get out of here fast enough. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching him, my arms hanging limp at my sides, my voice caught somewhere deep in my throat. He didn't look at me as he zipped the bag closed and slung it over his shoulder. He told me he was going to Chicago to meet his real parents. Said they were wealthy and probably waiting for him already, like some perfect family just waiting to welcome him home. Every word stung like a fresh cut, but I didn't let myself cry. I wanted to stop him, to grab his arm, to tell him he was making a mistake. But I couldn't bring myself to say anything. I just stood there in the kitchen, staring at the door long after it closed behind him, and the house felt emptier than it ever had before. The house felt colder after he left, as if all the warmth had walked out the door with him. I sat at the kitchen table long after the sound of his car faded down the street, staring at nothing in particular. The clock ticked on the wall, steady and unfeeling, while the quiet pressed in all around me. Later that night, I found myself in the little hall closet, pulling down an old shoebox full of papers and photos I hadn't touched in years. I sat cross-legged on the living room floor, my hands shaking slightly as I opened it. On top was a picture of Jason as a baby bundled in a blue blanket, his tiny fist resting against his cheek. I held that picture close, the tears finally slipping down my cheeks as I remembered how small and fragile he'd been. I remembered how I'd whispered promises to him in the dark hospital room, swearing I'd always protect him. The weight of everything settled on my shoulders, heavy, but somehow familiar. After a while, the tears slowed and something else started to grow inside me, quiet but steady. I realized no matter how much it hurt, I couldn't chase after him. He needed to find the truth for himself, even if it broke both our hearts in the process. I slipped the photo back into the box and closed it gently, my hands finally still. As I stood and turned out the light, I told myself this wasn't the end. He would see one way or another what love really looked like. And when that day came, I would still be here waiting. The mansion stood at the end of a long, tree-lined driveway, every inch of it polished and perfect, like something out of a magazine. Jason felt his stomach tighten as he walked up the steps, the weight of his suitcase heavy in his hand. He told himself this was what he wanted, the family he believed he deserved, but something about the cold marble and silent halls already made his chest feel tight. A woman opened the door before he could knock her blonde hair smooth, and her smile sharp but empty. She glanced at him as though she already knew who he was and stepped aside without saying much. Inside, everything gleamed. A crystal chandelier hung over the foyer, and the air smelled faintly of lemon polish and something sterile. They sat him down in a room that felt more like a showroom than a living space. His biological father barely looked up from his phone as his mother smoothed her skirt and finally spoke. She told him flatly that they'd been young, unprepared, and when he'd been born with a heart defect, the doctors made it clear it would take time, money, and patience to fix. Her eyes didn't soften as she explained they didn't want to spend their lives tied down by a sick baby. They wanted to move forward, to have other children who wouldn't drain them the way he would have. Jason stared at her in stunned silence, the words echoing in his head like a bell. He thought he'd come here to find love, to finally feel like he belonged, but all he felt was small and unwanted. Every detail of the house only made it worse. The perfect white rugs, the spotless windows, the quiet, all of it screamed of a life that had never had room for him. When they finally stood and told him they'd done what was best for everyone, he felt the truth settle deep in his chest. They hadn't given him up because they loved him. They'd thrown him away because they thought he was broken. And in that moment, he realized who had really saved him all those years ago. The call came just as the sun was starting to set, filling the kitchen with a soft orange glow. I almost didn't answer when I saw his name, but something in me couldn't let it ring. His voice was quiet at first, but then it cracked, and I heard him sobbing on the other end, asking why I had never told him the truth. I sat down at the table, pressing the phone close, and told him what I had always believed. From the very first moment I held him in my arms, he was mine. Nothing else had ever mattered to me. Not blood, not names, not the way people might look at us. There was silence for a while, just his breath shaky and uneven as he tried to speak. He said he didn't deserve me, that he was sorry that he didn't understand how much I had done for him until now. My own eyes blurred as I listened, but my voice stayed calm because I wanted him to hear how sure I was. I told him he had always been my son, and he always would be. There was nothing to forgive because nothing he could ever do would take away the love I had for him. I heard him whisper that he was coming home, and I just closed my eyes and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. When the front door finally opened the next morning, he stood there in the same clothes he'd left in his eyes, red and swollen. He didn't say a word before dropping his bag and walking straight to me, his head bowed. Then he sank to his knees in front of me, his hands clutching mine, and begged for my forgiveness. I cupped his face in my hands and looked at him, really looked seeing the boy he used to be and the man he was now all at once. I told him he didn't need to beg because he'd never lost me. Then I wrapped my arms around him as he cried into my shoulder, and for the first time in weeks, my heart finally felt whole again. The days after Jason came home felt different, like the air in the house was a little lighter. He moved through the room slower, now noticing things he'd never noticed before. I'd catch him watching me cook or fold laundry with this quiet kind of gratitude in his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. He started helping more without being asked, offering to fix the loose cabinet door or sweep the porch. He even came home one night with fresh flowers and set them on the table, saying he thought the kitchen looked prettier with them there. Sometimes, when I'd bring him his coffee in the morning, he'd take my hand and just say thank you, and even though it was such a small thing, it meant more to me than he probably realized. I began to see the boy he used to be again, the one who held my hand on walks and made me cards for Mother's Day with crooked hearts drawn in red crayon. He'd linger in the doorway at night just to tell me to sleep well, and when he hugged me before leaving for work, it felt like he was holding on a little longer than he used to. That heaviness that had settled in my chest started to lift. I won't lie and say it was easy to let go of the hurt completely. There were still nights I'd wake up thinking about the things he said before he left, those words that cut so deep. But with each day, I learned to release a little more of the resentment, to stop replaying the pain over and over. I reminded myself that love is messy and imperfect, but it's still worth holding on to. I even started taking time for myself, reading again in the evenings or planting flowers in the backyard. For so many years, I measured my worth by how much I could give him, and it took everything falling apart to remember I mattered too. Watching Jason come back to himself reminded me that it's never too late to grow, never too late to choose the kind of person you want to be. One afternoon, we were sitting on the porch together, just watching the sun dip behind the houses. He turned to me and said he didn't know why it took him so long to understand that family isn't about blood. His voice was soft but steady, and it made my heart swell. I thought about everything we'd been through, every sacrifice and every hurt, and I finally understood it too. Family is about love, plain and simple. The kind of love that stays even when it isn't easy. The kind of love that forgives and holds on, even when someone forgets how much they're worth to you. As the sky turned pink and the first stars appeared, I felt this quiet peace settle over me. We'd both been broken in our own ways, but somehow we'd found our way back to each other. And for the first time in a long time, I believed we were going to be just fine. If you've ever felt unappreciated as a parent, I just want you to know you're not alone. There are moments when it feels like everything you give goes unnoticed, like all your love and sacrifice aren't enough. But I promise you, the love you pour into someone never really disappears. It stays with them even when they can't see it yet. It lives in the quiet corners of their heart, and one day often, when you least expect it, they'll realize how much you've done for them. That love you gave will come back to you in ways you never imagined. Thank you for listening to my story and for letting me share this piece of my heart with you. If it touched you, please like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear these words, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. And above all, always trust your heart. It knows more than you think.